Good morning. My name's Don Coons, and today the subject, of course, is Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel. Well, let me begin by putting everything in perspective when all of this happened. It was a very special time in history. In fact, when we're doing European history, it's one of my favorite periods of history. You have to understand, if you are putting all of history into a particular order, this period of time comes up around 1200, 1300, 1400, more specifically the 1500s. The Middle Ages was coming to an end. The Middle Ages started in 476 AD with the fall of the Roman Empire, and for about 1,000 years we were in the Middle Ages, as we call it. Not a great deal of learning going on and not much progress going on, except primarily in the monasteries and so on. But today we're going to focus on that period of history when the Middle Ages comes to an end, and that's called the Renaissance. The Italian word meaning rebirth, rebirth. It's a rebirth of emphasis on humanism, creative ideas, advances in writing, inventions, advances in religion, exploration, and so on and so forth. Let me give you some examples of what was happening in the Renaissance, even before we get to Michelangelo. First of all, in literature at that time, famous books and articles being written. Sir Thomas More is going to write an article, Utopia. Utopia, Sir Thomas More. Well, what do we know? Utopia, the perfect society, the perfect world. Erasmus is going to write Praise of Folly. Why do I mention these two writings at this time? I mention them because of the fact that both of them refer to the fact that if you're going to improve life as we know it, you've got to have education. That's incredible to say at that time. Incredible. Most people at that time, in most cases, were illiterate. They could not read nor write. There was no formal education. And for men like Sir Thomas More and Erasmus in 1500 to say that education will give them a better life, that was incredible at that time. People didn't discuss. All you were interested in the morning is getting up and getting through the day and the basic needs to stay alive. You didn't worry about education. Another thing at this time, Machiavelli at this time will be writing a pivotal book. A pivotal book. It's going to change history. The Prince. The Prince. And what does the Prince say? When you get the power, hold the power, do whatever you have to do. It influenced all of history. Men later like Mussolini, Stalin, Adolf Hitler, and so on. Also at this time, there were great inventions at this time. Probably the most famous, according to biography, it is said to be the greatest invention of all in 1500. Johann Gutenberg, the printing press. The printing press. It's going to change all of history. It influences all of us right down today to the computer and so on and so forth. However, when I talk about the Renaissance, I could talk about writings and I could talk about inventions and all sorts of things, you say. However, what I like to emphasize is art, because in art you can see that we are ending the Middle Ages and we are entering a whole new age. In art is going to change, and visually, you can see the change. You can see the change visually. For instance, about the 1400s, in northern Italy, a wealthy family had constructed a chapel on their property, a chapel. You say, well, a lot of money, they don't have to go attend a church with common people. They'd have their own chapel on Sunday morning, you see. Well, the chapel was done and the interior had to be decorated. And someone said to the owner, listen, don't go hiring someone that's got to cost a great deal of money. I happen to know that there's a shepherd nearby. a shepherd. This shepherd is very talented. Hire the shepherd to paint the walls of the chapel. And it's at that point in history, at that point, when that shepherd comes into the church and starts painting, we now know we're entering a whole new age. The shepherd's name was Giotto, and he painted, and I want to mention this now because this has everything to do with Michelangelo. Giotto painted al fresco. Al fresco. Well, what does that mean? That means that he didn't just take the paints and paint on the plaster. He mixed up a whole new batch of plaster, put it on the wall while it was wet, and then paint on the plaster. Now, why is that wonderful? Because the painting isn't on the plaster, the painting's in the plaster. And later on in history, when they have to be cleaned and so on, they're just like, Later, I'm going to be talking about the Sistine Chapel ceiling. The Sistine Chapel ceiling is al fresco. It's done wet plaster. Well, anyway, Giotto comes to the chapel, and he paints al fresco. When we look at Giotto's paintings, and they're the paintings, many scenes from the life of Christ, but his paintings show emotion. The Greeks didn't have emotion in their painting or sculpture, neither did the Romans, but Giotto has emotion. Fear, murder, screaming, yelling, all sorts of things going on in the paintings. It's like we've gone from radio to television. Giotto. Well, I can mention other names at that time, of course, big names at that time that come down to us: Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli, Raphael, and so on. The list goes on and on and on and on. I know at Bloomsburg University, I had one whole semester of just Renaissance, Reformation, just names. So we're really just skimming the surface today, just at the very, very top, the cream of the crop, so to speak. Well, let's get to our subject. Michelangelo Bounarroti. Michelangelo Bounarroti. He was born just east of Florence, and it's important to tell you that geographically because Florence is considered the Renaissance city. The Renaissance. Anybody has gone to Florence, my wife loves to go to Florence. Her favorite city in Italy is Florence. If you go to Florence, of course, you see great works of art. So, the Renaissance city. Michelangelo was one of 5 sons. There were 5 boys. He was the center. He's the third in the middle, you see. When he was 6 years old, his mother died. And at that point, he will become interested in learning a trade in tools of a stone cutter. He was very interested in cutting stone. Incidentally, there'll be a riff at this time with his father. And the father will say to him throughout his life, why don't you get a normal job like the rest of your brothers and stop wasting time? Can you imagine? Michelangelo, stop wasting time. But that rift is there. And it seems, I'm just mentioning this, as he goes through his life, it seems that he's always trying to please the father. Is the father happy with this, and so on and so forth? But the father is displeased that he is a stone cutter. Well, anyway, Michelangelo will begin to grow up and very interested in cutting stone. Now, if he was interested in doing this type of work today and so on and so forth, perhaps we would send him to a Votech school. There aren't any Votech schools. There aren't any schools at that type of schools here. So he has to go and study where he can study. At that time in Florence, remember I said he was born very near the city of Florence, we have the famous Medici family in Florence, the bankers. Let's just talk about those Medicis just for a moment. Those Medicis were bankers and they loaned money. We know now it was an extremely high rate of interest. Some books even go to say at a rate of probably 40% interest. They were money lenders. They were very, 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 very wealthy. Very wealthy. If you go to Florence today and you're standing at the Arno River and you see the Porto Vecchio, the bridge going over the Arno, you'll notice that it's on 2 levels. There's a level for the general population to cross, and then there is a concealed area over the top of the bridge, a secret tunnel or passageway that was for the Medicis. They even travel in kind of secret in Florence so no one would approach them for money. Anyway, let's get back to the point. The Medici family, although they charged a great rate of interest and were very famous bankers, were very interested in the arts. They were the patron of the arts, you see. They would bring young artists in and pay for their lodging, give them clothing, give them food, give them housing, give them all their supplies they need. Let them create. Let them create. The patron of the arts, the Medicis. Well, Michelangelo, for a period of time, of course, received help from the Medicis, forming this new career of his, you see. Well, anyway, let's get back to Michelangelo. While with the Medicis, one day with a group of other stonecutters, he's given an assignment. Now remember, this is a young man, of course, at this time, hasn't done any formal cutting at this time, but he's given an assignment. What would we say today? Homework. And we know that the teacher, or the patron at that time, gave him a piece of marble, a small piece, not a big piece of marble, a relatively small piece of marble. By the way, let me stop right there. That marble is Carrara marble. It is probably the finest marble in the world. It comes from northern Italy, Carrara marble. So here's Michelangelo with this small piece of marble. Create whatever you want to create. So he started carving. And we know when he just got done with that small piece of marble, something wonderful was going to happen. We could tell by the marble. What did he choose as his subject? He chose Mary, the mother of Christ, you see. Mary. And Mary, in the carving, Mary is descending a staircase. In fact, it's called the Madonna of the Stairs. The Madonna of the Stairs. There she is, coming down the staircase, and she's holding the young Christ child. She's holding the child in her arms and coming down this staircase. Now that in itself would have been noteworthy and so on and so forth. However, when you look at it, what's interesting is it's one of his first carvings, and the Madonna of the Stairs is done in three-dimensional vision, you see. Unbelievable. Unbelievable for one of the first earliest carvings. Well, he's gone through all the training, and then Michelangelo, before we even get to any of the big works and so on, Michelangelo makes a big decision in his life. Big decision, you see. He said, you know, if you look back at the Greeks and you look back at the Romans, and you look at their carvings. Now, I'm not going to down the Greek and Roman carvings today. Some beautiful carvings from the Greeks and the Romans, you see. Venus de Milo, you see. Winged Victory of Samothrace, on and on and on. Beautiful carvings, and so on and so forth. But if you look at a Roman or Greek carving, you'll notice that the face is very, very, very stoic. Usually, Greek and Roman carvings are usually very perfect. They're the perfect height, the perfect weight. They're just perfect human beings, you see. And they are all staring, no expression and so on. And the finish is very, very, very smooth, very smooth. Michelangelo said that's not realistic. That's not realistic, you see. There's no expression in the face. The skin and so on and so forth, too smooth, too smooth. Michelangelo said, I can look at the hand and I can see the hand and I can see the arm. But what I would like to know is what's under the surface of the skin. Let me look at the arteries. Let me look at the muscle. Let me look at the veins. Let me look at that. Well, there's only one problem with that, you see. To dissect the human body at this time in history is considered by the church a mortal sin, you see. God created man. God created man. This is God's creation. You don't go around cutting it up, you see. Michelangelo said, if I could just take a dead person, a cadaver, and just cut it open, lay it open, and look at the muscles and veins and so on, you see, then I'd sew it up. When I do my carving, the arms, the legs, the torso, much more realistic. If I knew what was under this, then the surface would be much more realistic. Well, Where are we going to find a dead cadaver, you see? Well, we go to the monastery. We go to the monastery. Michelangelo went to the monastery, and he talked to the head abbot. And he said to the head abbot, is it true that you bring in bodies in here that are unclaimed? Well, today we'd say homeless people and so on that die on the street and have no relatives and so on. They would bring them into the monastery. And there was a morgue in the base of the monastery. You put the body down there. Now, if the body is unclaimed within a certain amount of time, then the monks would take the body and bury it in a common cemetery to the back of the monastery. So, Michelangelo says to the head abbot, is it true that you have cadavers down in the morgue? Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Would you mind if I go down there at night and dissect them, open them up and study? This is what I want to do. I want to study the muscles and the tendons and so on and so forth. And then when I'm done, I will simply sew them back up, you see. Could I do that? Well, the head abbot said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. That is a sin of the church. Well, Michelangelo was very persistent, and he would go night after night. Can I? No, no, no. And then, as we know from history, what happened was Michelangelo showed up at the monastery one night, and in showing up at the monastery, he went in to talk to the abbot, and the abbot wasn't in the hallway where he usually sat, but there was the candle burning on the table, and next to the candle was on the table laying a key. It was the key to the morgue. And we know that Michelangelo took the key and for months after that, every night, go down into the morgue and dissect bodies, you see, do drawings and so on and so forth. When he was on the street, when he would drop in at what we would say a bar, whatever, for a drink of wine or so on, people would say he smelled of the dead, smelled of the dead. But when he was done, after months of dissecting and studying and so on, he said, I am ready. I am ready to do it now. Well, at this time, you have to remember, it isn't like we think of the world today. If you're an artist and so on and so forth, you have to have a sponsor. For instance, at that time, you'd have to call somebody perhaps to your house to do a portrait or something, or a piece of sculpture or something. You have to be hired by people or an organization with a great deal of money. And at that particular time, the Catholic Church was building, of course, the Christian Church, St. Peter's of Rome. They were building the cathedral. They were building the cathedral. And at that particular time, Michelangelo was called to the Vatican, called to the Pope, and the Pope at that time was Pope Julius II. Called to the Vatican, and Pope Julius II said to him, we're building this church. I want a piece of sculpture for the front of the church. And indeed, that's where it is today. When you come into St. Peter's today, if you look just to the right, the first alcove, there it is, you see. Well, Michelangelo said, that's fine. I'm going to need marble. So he signed the contract, and the marble was brought from northern Italy, the Carrara marble. And Michelangelo, of course, commenced with what he wanted to do. And in this case, he wanted to do Mary. Mary, the mother of Christ, you see, at that point when Christ is taken down from the cross, the dead cadaver, and given to his mother, you see. So, we're going to carve Mary seated, and the body of the Christ across her. She's looking at, mother looking at her dead son. Pity, pietà, pietà, pity, you see. Well, there's a problem right from the beginning, and the problem is this. We have a man, Christ himself. We estimate at least 5'8", 5'9", okay? We have Mary, small, petite Jewish girl, maybe a little under 5 foot. Very, very, very short, in comparison to the son, you see. Well, the problem is this. If we have Mary, just Mary, holding the dead Christ, it's off balance. It's off balance. I mean, it just looks like it's got pulled to one side. It's ridiculous, you see. But Michelangelo is too sharp for that, you see. There he has Mary in a dress, and it has a very, very full skirt to the dress. Very full skirt to the dress, you see. Now lay the Christ across it, and of course there's perfect balance there. Perfect balance. Mary is alive. Christ, of course, brought down from the cross, the dead cadaver. Pietà, pity, you see. Well, it was done, and it was put, at that time, the custom was that when any big piece of art was done, the public could come and look at the art, you see. So the Pietà was moved to the front of St. Peter's, out on the piazza, you see. And people lined up to come and see the Pietà. And Michelangelo hid behind a pillar to hear what they were saying. He wanted to hear what the reaction was, you see. Well, it seems that everything was going fine until two women walked up to the statue. It's told in the Chronicles, two women discussing it. And one woman said to the other woman, well, who do you think did this? The other woman said, well, it could be so-and-so. And the first woman said, well, it could be so-and-so and so-and-so. Well, they went back and forth with an argument who they thought carved the statue. Well, Michelangelo had a violent temper, you see. And when all of the viewing was done and everyone left, he was in a rage. How dare anybody question his work? They should look at his work and know it's Michelangelo's. Nothing else compares to it. So he rushed out on the piazza, and on the statue, Mary has a strap across the bodice right here. There's a strap carved right here. And he took his hammer and chisel and he carved on it, Michelangelo Bounarroti. And he said they'll never question again who does fine art. And of course, it is the only piece of statuary that has his name on it, the famous Pietà. Well, today it's in St. Peter's. As you come through the main doors of St. Peter's, the first alcove, well, there's the famous Pietà, you see. It was brought to the United States in 1964. It was in the Vatican Pavilion at Flushing out on Long Island. And I remember being there, and I remember everybody was enthralled because they had movable sidewalks inside. When you went, of course, they couldn't possibly have just had people file past, because people would be standing there and the lines would go on forever. So you got on this movable sidewalk, and the sidewalk kept moving around the statue so you could see it. They said that when it was brought over, it was incredible because it was packaged by the Vatican and in a ship. And even if the ship sank, that case would not have sunk. Not only would the case not have sunk, it would have been able to be recovered. And not only that, but it even had flares on it. It would shoot flares and everything else. Well, nevertheless, the only one thing I want to say about it before I leave is the fact that if you ever have seen it, oh, you can see pictures, yes. But when you see the actual statue, it is so smooth, it's like English porcelain. Absolutely incredible. You can't believe he did it with a hammer and chisel. It's very, very, very smooth. Well, Pietà, that gets him going from the beginning. And who is he commissioned by? Of course, the church, Julius II, to do the Pietà. Now he's waiting for the next commission. Who's going to be next? And in this case, it's and of course he has other jobs that he's working on, but at this case, there's a big job comes through, and it comes from Florence itself, from the Renaissance city. It comes from the wool merchants, people who deal in sheep and wool and so on, a great deal of money. Great deal of money, these wool merchants, and they're all together, this association, so on, and they said they want a statue done that represents the city of Florence. The city of Florence. They want a statue that, when anybody thinks of this statue, they're going to think of the city of Florence. And the statue has to show strength. Strength. So Michelangelo was commissioned. The piece of marble was so great that it was on wagons pulled by oxen down from the north of Italy all the way down to Florence. This massive piece of marble. And as soon as it arrived, Michelangelo, of course, gets busy right away. He carves from the Old Testament David about to slew the giant Goliath, you see, from the Old Testament. And if you look at the statue of David, what's interesting is the fact that there is something, of course, out of proportion on the statue, and that is the hands. The hands are a little bit larger than they actually should be to show strength. He remembered what the association has said. The statue has to show strength, and it shows strength. David from the Old Testament, David. Today, when you think Florence, you think, oh, we've got to see the David. Did you see the David? That immediately comes to mind. Well, another great commission, and of course he's getting calls all around now and so on. However, the next one is another big commission, and it comes again from the Vatican, Julius II. So Michelangelo goes back to see the Pope. And the Pope says to him, you know, I'm not going to live forever. I'm not going to live forever, and at this point in my life, I want you to start working on my tomb. I want you to start working on my tomb, you see. Well, Michelangelo said, well, that's a good idea, and they, of course, drew up the plans and so on, and Michelangelo began working on the tomb. He actually began the construction and what the tomb was going to look like and so on. But he no sooner gets busy working on the tomb than the Pope calls him again. And the Pope says, well, yes, I'm not going to live forever. However, something else has to be done. And I want it done right now before you finish the tomb. So just let the tomb aside for a moment. We'll come back to that. There's something else. And it's at this time that Pope Julius takes him into the Sistine Chapel. Now, the Sistine Chapel is used by the Pope every day. It's the Pope's private chapel. It's where the Pope says Mass every morning. The Pope says Mass every day. Well, Julius took Michelangelo into the chapel, into the Sistine. Now, first of all, Michelangelo is now 33 years old. 33 years old. The Pope says to him, look at the ceiling. And Michelangelo does, and the Pope says, well, what do you think? The ceiling at that time was navy blue, and it had stars painted all over it. It was supposed to look like the celestial heavens, you see. Well, Michelangelo looked up, well, so what? And the Pope said, well, I don't like the ceiling. I don't like the ceiling. I want you to go up and paint something on the ceiling. Paint something on the ceiling. In fact, I have something in mind. Well, first of all, you have to understand when Julius II and Michelangelo get together, they're usually arguing about something, you see. And in this case, the argument starts. Michelangelo said he wasn't interested. He wasn't interested. Well, anyway, after arguing back and forth, Michelangelo said to the Pope, what do you want on the ceiling? And the Pope said, I want you to do the 12 disciples on the ceiling. Do the 12 disciples. That'll be wonderful. Michelangelo said, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. That's ridiculous. Forget it. I'm not doing it. Well, again, the argument, back, forth, back, forth, back, forth. Finally, Michelangelo consented he would do it. He'd do the 12 disciples up on the ceiling, you see. Well, let me tell you, I've just got some data here. The surface of the Sistine, just the surface of the Sistine, is 5,800 square feet. 5,800 square feet. When they put the scaffolding up for Michelangelo to go up, he's 50 feet above the floor. 50 feet above the floor. Ultimately, I'm getting it to in a moment, it will take him 4 years to do the ceiling. He'll be up there for 4 years. Now, let's get back to the problem. He goes up and he decides, yes, he's going to get started, and he starts on the first disciple. He gets about halfway through and says, wait a minute, wait. What am I doing this for? I didn't want to do the job. I hate the subject, and nobody's making me do it. I can do a lot of other jobs. I don't need this. And so just throws the paint aside and comes down and says he's not going up. By the way, when he went up and started doing the ceiling, this has to be mentioned now. The ceiling is in al fresco. Al fresco. Now, I say to my classes, now to that probably that means nothing to you. To you, that means absolutely nothing. In other words, but I say this to you, if you've ever painted a ceiling, that's an experience, you see. This man's going up, and before he starts painting, he's putting wet plaster up there that's dripping on him. And while the plaster's dripping, he's painting in it. Incredible, you see. Well, anyway, comes down, I'm not doing anything. So again, a big argument with the Pope. Finally, the Pope says, listen, I don't care what you do. Just do the ceiling. You select what you want to do. You make the selection. I don't care. Just do the ceiling. So Michelangelo agrees, and the scaffolding is put up. Now, I'm going to go through the whole bit of the Sistine, and then you're going to see video, you see. When he got up there, this is most interesting. First of all, he divided the ceiling into 9 blocks, 9 rectangular blocks. In other words, if you go from one end of the Sistine to the other, 1, 2, 3, up to 9. There are 9 blocks across the ceiling, you see. You would think he would start in block 1, but he does not. He starts in block 9, and he works backwards. He starts in block 9, and he works backwards. Now, somebody said to him, Michelangelo, why are you starting in block 9 and coming backwards? He said, because in the first blocks is God, and I don't know really what God looks like yet. I have to think about that. So if I start in 9 and I start coming back, by the time I get to the first blocks, then I'll know what God looks like. Then I can go ahead and paint. I don't know yet. So he starts at 9 and he comes back. Now, I want to mention this before I get into the details of the blocks. The first time I saw the Sistine, somebody said to me, before you go to Italy, I know the ideal thing for you to do when you go in, if you want to enjoy the ceiling, all you have to do is just lay on your back on the floor. I wouldn't recommend that because about 8,000 people are going to tramp right over you, you see. When you get in there, it's like shoulder to shoulder. Today, of course, that would not be allowed, but it just congested. The other interesting thing is I like to listen to what people are saying around me. People who don't understand the ceiling are just standing there saying, oh, isn't it beautiful? Isn't it beautiful? Da, 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 da. Have no idea what they're looking at, you say. Well, isn't it interesting? And then they go on like an ordinary tourist. Michelangelo is telling you a story. He's telling you a story from the beginning to the middle to the end. You're going to see the whole thing today. You're going to see time in the beginning. You're going to see what has transpired since then, and you're also going to see what's coming in the future, all in one room, you see. But most people, I would say, it would be interesting if you could really gauge that, how many people really understand what they're looking at. You will, till the end of this meeting today, you know that. Well, anyway, let's go to the ceiling. And we're going to look at the first 3 blocks. Where does Michelangelo get his inspiration? From the Old Testament of the Bible. It's not that creative. Michelangelo just simply opened the cover of the Bible and started to read from Genesis, you see. He just started to read from Genesis. And that's what he's creating in the first 3 blocks. It's God in creation. For instance, the first block, God is dividing light from darkness. This is the darkness, this is the light. This is the day, this is the night. He's dividing. In the second block, God's doing the stars, the sun, the moon, the planets, all from Genesis, you see. First, God's creating. The first 3 blocks, God is creating. In fact, in one block, Michelangelo doesn't have a motion picture camera, so he has God coming towards you, and he has God going away from you. It's God, only one God, but he's trying to show you motion. God is just moving through and he's creating, you see. In the third block, he's separating the land and the sea and the mountains and so on. God is creating. So it's easy to remember, in the first 3 blocks of the Sistine Chapel on the ceiling, it's the creation by God. It's from Genesis, and it's from the beginning of the Bible, It's the 4th block that gets everybody's attention. It's the 4th block that's famous everywhere. Everybody recognizes the 4th block. Because when God gets done with all the creation of the land and the sea and the stars and the moon, God creates man. And in the 4th block is the creation of man, you see. There's God. There's Adam, you see. Adam is, of course, all constructed, but Adam is not alive. Adam's kind of limp, and he has his hand hanging out like this. God is reaching over, and the fingers are very, very close. When God's finger touches Adam's finger, Adam will come alive. The creation of man, God and Adam, you see. The fourth block, it's probably the most famous of all the blocks, the creation of man. In the fifth block, God realizes man must have a mate. Man must have a mate. So in the fifth block, Adam is asleep, and God is extracting a rib and the creation of woman. The creation of woman. The creation of man, the creation of woman. So far, the first three, creation of the world. The fourth is the creation of man. Fifth is the creation of woman. However, it's in the fifth block, the sixth block, rather. It's in the sixth block that, if you'll excuse my French, all hell breaks loose. Indeed. The sixth block is divided in half. It's the Garden of Eden. And you have the tree with the serpent wrapped around it, you see. Adam and Eve have been told by God, full reign of the garden, just don't eat the fruit of this particular tree. Well, on the left-hand side of the panel, the left of the tree, there they are sampling the fruit. The right-hand side of the painting, they're being expelled from the garden. Expelled from the garden. God is angry. God is very, very angry. Original sin. God is angry, you see. And God takes that out on the last three panels, 7, 8, and 9. 7, 8, and 9 is Noah, the great flood. God is angry, and God brings a flood upon the earth, you see. Flood upon the earth. In that painting, you have the waters lapping up, people screaming, yelling, being pulled into the water, running for higher ground for their lives, and so on. Noah, you see. And the last one, the very, very, very last block, is called the drunkenness of Noah. It seems that in Genesis, Noah, a tiller of the soil, was the first to drink of the vine. The story is in the Bible that Noah drank too much wine, you see, and was in a drunken stupor, and also the fact that he was not clothed, he didn't have any clothes on him. When his sons found him, they, of course, brought something to cover him. Now, why Michelangelo, that particular story, but I think he was trying to relate all types of stories about Noah and put them together. Anyway, the boys will come in and put the cloth over so that no one will see him in this drunken stupor and so on. It's a story. Again, it's from Genesis. It's called the drunkenness of Noah. So there you have the 9 panels. There you have the 9 panels. Again, the first 3, creation, 4th, man, 5th, woman, 6th, the Garden of Eden, 7, 8, and 9, the great flood. When I leave the ceiling itself, God is angry. God is very, very angry, you see. Now, let's go on with the story. Michelangelo doesn't stop there, you see. In the Sistine, when you look at the 4 corners, the corners that go up to the ceiling, where the corner meets the ceiling, it's not a direct 90-degree angle. In the 4 corners, the corners are kind of rounded. They're rounded, you see. So you have the 9 panels. Then when you get to the corners, they're kind of, to come down to the wall, it's not this abrupt stop and then you come down. There's this roundedness in the corners that you can paint something in the 4 corners. And in that corner, in those corners, Michelangelo paints God, reconciliation. God is over his anger, and he comes to the aid of his people. Again, they're called the 4 plenitudes, the 4 corners, the 4 corners. God is over his anger. God comes to the rescue of his people. What's in the 4 corners? Well, in one, this would make sense. David and Goliath, you see. David about to kill the giant. God will help him. reconciliation, you see. In another corner, we have the bronze serpent from Numbers, from the book of Numbers. The bronze serpent, you see, where God is very angry at his people because they're worshiping idols, so he sends great snakes and so on and so forth. But then some of them want to turn back to God, so he says, put the gold serpent on a pole and so on and so forth, and so on. And I'll say, you all know the story. God's reconciliation, again, reconciliation. The one corner is kind of graphic because the one corner is Judith and Holofernes from the book of Judith. Judith, of course, let me get the story in perspective. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of the Assyrians, and he invaded the Western nations. And of course, they invaded Judea. And of course, there was this girl by the name of Judith, and she and her handmaids looked for asylum. When the Assyrians came in, they looked for asylum, and she said, well, could she please stay in the camp of Holofernes? Holofernes was a general. Will he protect her? Well, he allowed her to stay, but I'm afraid he had ulterior plans. And Holofernes threw a big banquet. And of course, what he planned to do was have everyone drink of the wine and so on. Judith would drink of the wine, and then he was going to seduce her, you see. Well, the banquet takes place, and Holofernes takes Judith, of course, to his room, and he's going to seduce her. But he is so drunk that he falls on the bed and he falls asleep. Judith at that time prays to God, and God gives her strength, and she takes Holofernes' sword and decapitates him, cuts his head off. So in that corner, there is Judith and her handmaid, Holofernes, of course, decapitated, and she's carrying the platter with the head on it. What am I saying? In every corner of the reconciliation, God coming to man's defense. Helps David, helps Moses. Over here he helps, of course, Judith. God is over his anger. God is coming to help them. The last book, of course, is from the book of Esther, and it's the story of Haman. It seems that Esther was introduced to the Persian court under the king Xerxes, and nevertheless, there was a man by the I'll bring it all down. This isn't a Bible study, but I just want you to know what's happening in the picture. Anyway, there was a man by the name of Haman, and Haman was appointed as the prime minister. Haman was very, very much prejudiced against Jewish people. He didn't like Jewish people. And one day he was out walking, and he saw a Jewish man by the name of Mordecai, and he said to Mordecai, you will get down on the ground and you will worship me. And Mordecai said, I won't do that. I only worship God. And of course, Haman said, all right, then we'll have you put on a cross, you see, and have you tortured. Well, Esther heard this, and she went to the king, and the king found out what was going on, and it wasn't Mordecai who went to the cross, it was Haman. You see, God comes to Haman's defense. Not to Haman, but Esther's defense, you see. And in this particular case, the rightful man who is doing the horrible work, prejudice and so on, is tortured. God comes to the aid again. So what do we have? We have creation, we have man, woman, we have the great flood, God very, very angry, but then God is over his anger in the four corners. Reconciliation, God comes to the aid. Michelangelo was not done yet. He dropped down on the walls. Today, the Greeks used to say if you had a plain room just painted and you had a border in the room up near the ceiling, that border would be called a frieze. A frieze. Well, I think Michelangelo did kind of a frieze here, you see. He has the beginning. He has the Old Testament, he has God in reconciliation. Now he drops down on the wall just a bit, and he paints characters all around the room, you see. There are two types of characters. Some are prophets, and some are sibyls. The prophets are there for the Jewish people, the sibyls are there for the Gentiles. The prophets for the Jewish people, the sibyls for the Gentiles, you see. Jonah, Jeremiah, the Persian Sibyl, Ezekiel, the Erythrian Sibyl, Joah, Zechariah, the Delphinian Sibyl, Isaiah, the Cumean Sibyl, Daniel, the Liberian Sibyl. They're all around the room. They all have a message. The prophets have a message. The Sibyls have a message. They all have the same message. Some are reading from books. Some are simply talking, you see. The message is, the Messiah's coming. The Messiah's coming, you see. And that's where Michelangelo ended the Sistine. The 9 blocks, the creation, man, woman, the great flood. The 4 corners, God's reconciliation. Now, what's the message to the people? That comes down a little further. The Messiah's coming. The Messiah's coming. And that's where Michelangelo left. Now, if you go to the Sistine today, on this side over here, you have the story of Moses. That's for and of course not done by Michelangelo, that's done for the Jewish people. The Jewish people are still waiting for the Messiah. Hasn't come yet. On this side of the room, you have pictures from the story of Christ. This is for the Gentiles. The Messiah has come. So you have Moses on this side and, of course, Christ on the other side. And there you have it, the Sistine, you see. Well, Michelangelo is done. Julius II is in very poor health, so Michelangelo goes back. He's finishing the tomb, you see. Now, I want to talk about the tomb. If you go to Rome today, I'm just going to talk about, then we're going to go back into the Sistine. If you go to Rome today and you go to the Colosseum, behind the Colosseum, behind the main doors where you enter to go to, behind it is a hill. Well, Rome, the 7 hills. There's a hill, and there's a lot of houses there. It's part of the city. But if you go up that hill, you'll come to a church. Now, the church does not have a steeple. You'll know it's a church, though, because it's a larger building than all of the houses and has the appearance of but it doesn't have a steeple on it. Nevertheless, go inside. That church is called St. Peter in Chains. St. Peter in Chains. When Peter was arrested, of course, after Christ's death, Peter's arrested. He is put into chains and taken into Rome. And the Romans say to him, "How do you want to die?" And Peter said, "I want to die like Christ, crucify me." And the Romans said, "We'll do something better." They put him on a cross, turned it upside down, you see, allowed the blood to rush to his head, you see. Well, anyway, when you go into that church, there's the altar straight ahead of you, and the guide will take you aside and take you up to show you. Under the altar is a huge glass sarcophagus. You can look into the sarcophagus. There are the chains that held Peter. That's why the church is called St. Peter in Chains. However, when you're in the church, you're going to spend very little time looking at the chains, because I assure you that while she's talking, your head's probably going to be turning like this. Your head's going to be turning like that. Because over here is the tomb of Julius II. The tomb of Julius II. And why are you looking over there? Because there's a huge statue on it carved by Michelangelo, and the statue is Moses. Moses. Moses is so realistic, you see, that when Michelangelo finished it, he took his hammer and banged it against the statue and screamed, "Speak, speak," you see. Well, anyway, I didn't want to get too far from the Sistine, because you probably wonder, well, what happened to the Pope? Well, the Pope died. Michelangelo finished the tomb. It's in the church of St. Peter in Chains. St. Peter in Chains, just near the Colosseum. Now, we're going to do something a little extra special. Neil's going to help me with this. I'm going to put on 2 things for you. Well, I'll announce the second one later. The first one is from the movie The Agony and the Ecstasy, you see. The Agony and the Ecstasy. Charlton Heston will play Michelangelo. Rex Harrison will play the Pope. I want to show you just 3 clips from the movie. The first clip is going to show when the Pope is taking Michelangelo aside and saying, I want something done with this ceiling, you see. I want you to get up there and paint, and then you hear the argument going on. The second quick scene is when Michelangelo is actually up doing the painting, and the Pope keeps checking on him all the time. By the way, when I was at the Vatican, I asked the question, did he lay on his back up there? And they said, no, he probably stood. Now, can you imagine, over 4 years, can you imagine the intense pain and so on? Well, anyway, and the last scene is, of course, when the Sistine under Julius II is dedicated, and there's this big service, and it's the very end of the movie. You'll find very interesting. So here we have it. Neil's going to take us now. This is the Agony and the Ecstasy, Charlton Heston and Rex Harrison. Take a quick look, and I'll be back. Oh, now we're back. You've seen the scene, of course, from the scenes from the Agony and the Ecstasy. There's one other thing that I wanted to show you. When I was in Rome and at the Vatican, I picked up another video that I thought was most interesting. Over the years, don't forget, Michelangelo did this in the 1500s. Over the years, 400 to 500 years, the Vatican chapel is used every day by the Pope. The Pope goes in every day, says daily Mass, you see. Well, the candles are lit and so on, and over the years, the soot and so on from the candles lifted upward and rested on the ceiling. By the 1900s, that ceiling did not have its regular luster and beautiful color and so on and so forth. So around the 1970s, the Vatican decided to have the ceiling cleaned, and they brought in Nippon of Japan to do it. And what I brought to you today, I just want you to see a small portion of this. I wanted you to see the cleaning process, which is absolutely incredible. Remember this massive ceiling, and it's going to take them years and years and years to clean the ceiling. If you go there today, because it's al fresco, you see, the ceiling is its usual brightness and so on, just as it was in the time of Michelangelo. So I'm going to ask Neil right now to put that on. We're going back to the Vatican. This is what I brought back. This is Edmund Newman from NBC News talking, and watch, they're going to show you. I just want you to see the process of how they clean the ceiling. Absolutely incredible. Let's take a look. Go ahead, Neil.
This is a progress report on a job of restoration that will take 12 years in one of the most cherished and celebrated structures anywhere in the world. I'm speaking to you from the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican, where the cardinals of the Roman Catholic Church meet to elect their supreme pontiff. The chapel still fulfills the function for which it was built. It is the center of Vatican ritual. Pope John Paul II celebrates Mass here in sight of the works his Renaissance predecessors wished into being. One of them, Julius II, was the nephew of Sixtus IV, who built and gave his name to the Sistine Chapel. Julius II commissioned the Florentine artist Michelangelo Bounarroti to paint scenes from the creation on the ceiling of this chapel. That ceiling originally showed the traditional starry firmament. Michelangelo was then in his 34th year. Renowned as a great sculptor, he himself at first believed that painting was not yet his profession. He wrote to his father, "May God help me." The works he painted here are among the peaks of Western art. In a mere 4 years, Michelangelo painted the relationship between God and man from the creation to the flood. In the middle of the 16th century, Michelangelo's contemporary Vasari wrote,
"There is no other work to compare with this for excellence, nor could there be. It is scarcely possible even to imitate what Michelangelo accomplished."
This judgment has stood the test of time. The chapel was built in the second half of the 15th century. The exterior, with its defensive battlements, is a reminder that the papal state was a temporal as well as spiritual power, then as now. It has roughly the dimensions the Bible gives for the Temple of Solomon. Let me open this model of the chapel. Michelangelo began work here in 1508. By that time, some of the greatest artists of the Renaissance, among them Perugino, Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Cosimo Rosselli, had painted scenes from the life of Moses on one side of the chapel and scenes from the life of Jesus on the other. The same artists and their workshops painted effigies of the early popes above their own work. For 4 years from then on, that is until 1512, Michelangelo, almost alone and on a specially constructed scaffold, painted the creation on the ceiling. More than 20 years later, at the age of 60, he returned to the Sistine Chapel at the invitation of Pope Clement VII. Over the next 5 years, he painted the Last Judgment over the altar. What you have hitherto seen in reproductions, or if you came to Rome, of the original paintings, was Michelangelo's work after the passage of 4.5 centuries. Dirt, soot, the deposits of innumerable candles, and animal glue had darkened, not to say veiled, these monumental achievements. Then, in 1980, the Vatican art authorities set their restorers the task of returning Michelangelo's work, as far as is humanly possible, to its original state. In 1981, work started on the lunettes, or half circles, above the sidewall windows. The cameras of Nippon Television began recording the restoration step by step from the summer of 1982. On these lunettes, Michelangelo painted the ancestors of Christ according to the list given by St. Matthew at the beginning of his gospel. The Last Judgment apart, these lunettes are the only vertical surface in the entire restoration. The man in charge of the restoration is the art historian Fabrizio Mancinelli.
You have to take into account that we are working in the Sistine Chapel since 1964. And at the very beginning we planned to make simply the cleaning of the 15th century popes. And then we realized that the glues and the glues that covered the frescoes of Michelangelo and that had been applied over them for conservation and for restoration purposes had started detaching the painted surface of the frescoes. And therefore the work had become urgent.
The chief restorer for the 12-year project is Gianluigi Colalucci. Working with him are two highly skilled and experienced restorers, Maurizio Rossi and Pier Giorgio Bonetti. Their assistant is Bruno Baratti. Every week, Monday to Friday, for 12 years, they will clean and restore Michelangelo's works inch by inch. First, the surface of each fresco is sponged with water, after which successful and faithful restoration needs a chemical solvent and a rigorous method. Sometimes fine Japanese paper is applied with water to ensure that the solvent will permeate the surface evenly. The chemical solvent is brushed on. After 3 minutes, the paper is peeled off. The surface is then carefully wiped with a moist sponge, which removes the solvent and the surface grime. Very different from restoration work done in the 18th century, done either with bread dipped in water or with sponges dipped in Greek wine, the resonated Greek wine acting as a solvent when mere water proved too mild. The surface is left to dry for 24 hours, and the process is repeated a few more times. Each fresco brings a different problem, but it became clear that using one solvent here, another solvent there, would not produce a uniform result. The layer of accumulated dirt was too irregular. The restoration needed a mixture of solvents. The chemical solvent.
There were two other things I want to tell you before I end up today. In that film, we didn't see enough of it, but I found it was interesting. One day they were up there cleaning, and they stopped all production, and they had the officials of the Vatican come in. They had found several bristles from one of his brushes stuck in the ceiling. He was painting with such force that some of the bristles were there. And the other thing they found was that when he did the plenitudes on the sides, he would paint with his right hand, and he'd have to brace himself with his left hand. And when he was done, he would wipe out the imprint of his left hand. And one day he forgot, and so his fingerprints were even on the ceiling of the Sistine. Well, Pope Julius will die. And of course, we talked about his tomb, Moses, you see. And Pope Clement VII will take over. And Michelangelo will return to the Sistine. And just as the Pope before him asked, he's going to have to do something behind the main altar. In other words, the ceiling's done, the sides are done, but the wall behind the main altar is bare. And it's up to Michelangelo what he wants to paint. That was simple. Here's the beginning. Here, of course, the announcement of the Messiah and so on. On the front wall, he puts what is going to come in the future. And Michelangelo paints the fresco, of course, the Last Judgment of Christ. The Last Judgment of Christ, the last day. Now, I'll explain it briefly, and then we're going on because of time. Christ is in the center. Christ is in the center, and he is judging. He is judging. I'd estimate him about 32, 33 years old, very muscular, powerful, his hand over his head. The hand almost means you to this side, you to that side. He's judging, you see. Mary right next to Christ, shielding her face. She knows what's going to happen, and she really doesn't want to be a part of it, you see. She knows what's coming, but she doesn't want to look at it, you see. The bottom of the painting near the floor are the graves, and the graves are opening, and those that have passed away, and so they are coming forth to be judged. So the bottom of the painting, the graves and so on, opening. The caskets are opening on the bottom. The right-hand side of the painting are people who are ascending to heaven. By the way, the whole painting looks like there's a massive gush of wind, and everything is flowing and moving and so on and so forth throughout the painting. The people to the here's Christ to the left of the painting. Those are the people ascending to heaven. To the right of the painting, those going to everlasting damnation. Up at the top, there are two lunettes, two rounded areas, and there are the angels flying up there. And the angels are carrying, in most cases, the implements of the crucifixion. Some are carrying the cross. Some are carrying the crown of thorns. Some are carrying the robe of Christ. Some the dice. Some that type of thing. All of the characteristics of the crucifixion. Now let's go back to Christ again. Christ is in the center, and there are notables of the church around Christ. For instance, Adam is there, John the Baptist is there, St. Peter is there, so on and so on. They're grouped around Christ. Also around Christ are people who were early victims of the Roman Empire, followers of Christ that were tortured. They're also around Christ. For instance, you have St. Lawrence is there. St. Lawrence. When they killed St. Lawrence, they had an iron. They ripped his clothes off him, the Romans did, and they had an iron, piece of iron that they had put in the fire and threw him on the iron. And so he's holding this gridiron, so to speak. There's as I said, all kinds of saints. One of the saints is, it's St. Catherine, I believe, holding a wheel. They lashed her to a wheel and rolled it down the hill and killed her. She's holding the wheel. St. Andrew is holding the cross of St. Andrew that he was killed on, and so on. The one that probably is of the most interest is St. Bartholomew. St. Bartholomew is near Christ, just to the, let's see if you look at the painting, just to the right of Christ. There is St. Bartholomew. St. Bartholomew, they grabbed him and ripped his skin off of him. The Romans were famous for torture, and they ripped the skin off of him. So St. Bartholomew is sitting there holding a piece of his skin. And the skin is hanging in layers, you see, in folds. And if you look at the folds very closely, you'll see the face of Michelangelo. They're in the folds of the skin, you see. Someone said to him, Michelangelo, why did you paint yourself on the condemned side? And he said, because I'm not worthy to see the face of God. So his face is in the full St. Bartholomew, of course, holding that skin and so on and so forth. Now, again, the left-hand side of the painting, the people ascending into heaven, you see, very joyful and happy. The right-hand side of the painting, the people going down to everlasting damnation. And they're screaming, and the helpers of the devil and so on are pulling them down and so on and so forth. But down in the lower right-hand corner is the devil himself. And according to the Greeks, when you die and if you're going to hell, you'll go to meet the devil. He'll be waiting for you near the river Styx. Well, there's the devil, and he's in a rowboat, and as these people are being brought down, he's knocking them into the rowboat with his oar, the oar from the boat, you see, and then they'll go across the river Styx, and there, of course, the fires of hell. Now, the last part of the painting that's most interesting that you would look at, most people probably have no idea, and they walk right past it. But when Michelangelo was doing this, and by the way, he will be working on the Last Judgment for 5 years. 5 years of his life, he's just doing this one painting. Well, anyway, after the Pope would say Mass in the morning and the Pope would leave, Michelangelo would move in to start working on the painting again. And At that time, can you imagine it today with the security we have today? The doors of the Sistine would be thrown open and you could go and you could watch him painting, you see. And a group of people would come every day in their spare time and watch Michelangelo painting. And there was one man that came and he taunted him all the time. He didn't like the painting and he kept screaming at Michelangelo, "It's a horrible painting. The painting has nudes in it. The painting itself should be in a bar room, not in the Vatican," on and on and on. Michelangelo never responded. The man came every day and criticized it. He never responded. But when the painting was unveiled and done, down in the lower right-hand corner in the fires of hell is the man who was taunting him. And not only is he in the fires of hell, but he is wrapped with snakes, you see. Well, let that be a lesson for whatever, you see. Well, let me finish up here because I have to watch my time. Michelangelo, of course, finished The Last Judgment. He's now in his early 80s. They're building St. Peter's in Rome. And now, first of all, Michelangelo, architect. Michelangelo, well, he's going to be architect. Painter, sculptor, now architect. Painter, sculptor, now architect. They ask him to help with the planning of the building of St. Peter's. And Michelangelo will design, although he won't see it, he will design the largest dome in the world. The dome on St. Peter's is designed by Michelangelo, you see. Well, I just want to say just a few things about him and then I'm out. What was the man like? We know he took daily walks, you see. By the way, never married. He never married. Remember the scene in the movie? The woman looks at it and she said, "Well, you married." Well, it's true. He married his work. He said that himself. He wasn't interested in being married. He was too busy with his work. So, of course, never married. Dressed very poorly. Michelangelo was not worried. You would not find Michelangelo in Gentleman's Quarterly. You would find Leonardo da Vinci. He, of course, the famous styles of the times, you say, Michelangelo, he looked like a bum coming up and down. He really didn't care what he looked like. Then we know he wore soft leather boots all the time, that we do know, and a broad-rimmed hat he would put on his head. Food, what did he eat? Pasta, fish, green salads, cheese, and wine. And with that, of course, a good Italian bread would go with that. I thought this was interesting. He slept very, very, very little. It reminds me of Thomas Edison. Michelangelo slept very little. Also, if you read up on Martha Stewart's another one, she only sleeps 3 to 3.5 hours a night, you see. Well, it's kind of interesting. You can talk about that for a while. Well, anyway, Michelangelo died in February of 1564. He was just a few weeks before his 90th birthday. And they went to his apartment. Well, apartment. It was a room. It was a flat. In it was a bed. There was a nightstand with candle. There was a little table with 2 chairs, and so on and so forth. Anyway, they went to the apartment. There was a bit of clothing that he had, but on the table was a small can. And he had, of course, had all these commissions from the Vatican, all of this money. And he didn't spend it. All he spent it on was primarily for food and for artistic supplies. And they opened the can and found that the money contained was between $250,000 million was in the can. So there you have it, Michelangelo. Now, before I leave, Neil's back in the room, and he is going to tell me that we have a question or two.
Yeah, I think we have time for one question.
One question.
That is, where is the very first sculpture he did? I guess, where is it located?
If you were to go to the books and so on, again, I may be wrong on this one, but knowing what he did and where he did it, I would start in Florence. I would start in the Renaissance. That's where he was from. That's where he did the Madonna of the Stairs. So that's probably the first evidence of carving would be somewhere near the city of Florence. Not Rome, because he's not down that far yet. Florence for the first part of his career. Okay? Thank you. Have a good day today.